What if I told you that the great warriors of the North could keep meat fresh for years without a single gram of expensive salt? In the harsh world of 8th century Scandinavia, survival depended not only on the sharpness of a sword, but also on the ability to stop time inside food. These people did not know electric refrigerators, but they turned the earth, water, and air into perfect preservation tools. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how an ordinary pit and sour milk concentrate allowed the Vikings to cross the ocean without the threat of starvation. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the Northern Masters, which allowed them to defeat decay without the use of fire or ice. The Vikings had a deep understanding of soil physics and used its natural thermoregulation to create stable temperature zones. They dug deep shafts below the frost line, where a constant cool temperature was maintained throughout the year. The walls of these pits were lined with thick turf and stones, creating a thermos effect, completely isolated from the outside world. Inside these underground storage facilities, food never froze completely or overheated in the sun. Food remained in a state of deep thermal rest, which slowed down any biological processes of decay. To protect against rodents and excess moisture, Northerners often used birch bark with its antiseptic properties. Bags made of animal skins were laid on layers of dry moss, which effectively absorbed any condensation. This system allowed for reliable storage of supplies throughout the long winter, when hunting was practically impossible. It is important to understand that this was not just a pit, but a well-thought-out engineering structure with natural ventilation. Every detail of the design worked to preserve the precious energy of food. These storage facilities were located directly under residential buildings or in close proximity to protective walls. Access to food was possible even during the strongest blizzards without having to go outside. Complete darkness and the absence of excess oxygen in tightly closed pits effectively slowed down the oxidation of fats. The Vikings noticed that oil buried in the ground in leather bags acquired a special taste and aroma. This practice required iron discipline and precise knowledge of seasonal changes in the behavior of the local soil. Underground storerooms were real treasure troves on which the life of the settlement depended during the long period of expansion. Without the ability to store surplus food, the warriors of the North would never have been able to gather the strength for their great campaigns. They literally preserved the short summer, hiding it under tree roots and heavy stone slabs. This art of survival was passed down from father to son as the highest wisdom of the harsh climate. The construction of such cellars began with the selection of a site with the driest soil and the lowest groundwater level. The craftsmen carefully ensured that moisture did not seep through the stonework and spoil the grain. The interior space was divided into compartments for different types of products so that the smells would not mix. Sometimes large stones were placed in the pits, which served as natural cold accumulators during the summer. Particular attention was paid to the tightness of the top cover, which was often covered with a layer of earth or peat. This created an additional barrier to warm air, trying to penetrate inside on hot days. Under such conditions, even fresh meat could lie for weeks without losing its basic nutritional qualities. The Vikings believed that the earth would preserve their gifts if they treated the construction of the warehouse with due respect. Each settlement had several such strategic facilities, hidden from the eyes of potential enemies and looters. The location of underground storage facilities was often kept secret and known only to the elders or owners of the estate. This was a guarantee that in the event of a siege or crop failure, the community would not be left without a means of subsistence. The technology was so effective that its elements were used in Scandinavian villages for centuries. Earth refrigerators allowed not only meat to be stored, but also valuable roots gathered in the forests. The humidity inside the pits was maintained at a level that prevented vegetables from drying out and rotting. It was a triumph of practical experience over the unpredictable nature of the northern frontier. People of that time saw the soil not just as dirt, but as a living environment capable of providing cold. Concluding the description of these cellars, it is worth noting their incredible durability and ease of maintenance. Once built, a shaft could serve several generations of the same family without major repairs. It was the highest form of eco-friendly engineering, created without a single drawing on paper. We would love to hear your opinion. What do you think about these earth refrigerators? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about why Viking food might seem unbearable to us in terms of smell? One of the most effective methods of storage was fermentation, or controlled fermentation in the complete absence of salt. The Vikings discovered that limiting oxygen access to fish caused it to produce beneficial lactic acid. This acid inhibits the growth of putrefactive bacteria and turns the product into a long-lasting and safe concentrate. The resulting product had an extremely pungent aroma, but contained vitamins necessary to combat dangerous scurvy. In the absence of fresh vegetables, such fermented food was the only source of health on long voyages. Meat was also often subjected to similar processing in regions where salt extraction was practically impossible. It was tightly packed into barrels and sprinkled with crushed lingonberries or cranberries. The benzoic acid from forest berries worked just as well as modern chemical additives and preservatives. The combination of fermentation and natural antiseptics created a barrier that time simply could not overcome. The product became very soft and could survive the longest sea voyages across the stormy ocean. The Vikings did not just store food, they changed its chemical structure for the sake of calories. Fermented products were the mainstay of their diet during raids on distant European coasts. The warriors took with them lightweight barrels that did not require ice for cooling during the journey. This gave them a huge advantage in speed over armies tied to heavy wagons. Every drop of juice in such a barrel was the result of centuries of experience observing the world. The masters monitored the sounds and smells coming from the barrels during the active phase of maturation. If fermentation was too rapid, the barrels were moved to a cooler place or covered with snow. The secrets of proper fermentation were considered family treasures and were carefully guarded from prying ears. Fish prepared in this way was valued more highly than fresh fish because of its high energy value. Oak or pine wood was used for fermentation, which also imparted its beneficial resins to the product. The inner surface of the barrels was sometimes burned with fire for additional disinfection before a new batch was placed inside. The Vikings understood that the cleanliness of the vessel directly affected the taste and shelf life of the contents. It was a complex process that turned raw meat into a real elixir of life. Even in the harshest years, fermentation made it possible to save the catch, which would otherwise have simply rotted. This gave the community confidence that protein-rich food would be available all year round. The technology was so advanced that we can still see its echoes in modern Scandinavian cuisine. The ability to control invisible microorganisms was akin to magic for the people of that distant time. Every village had its own specialists who knew the ideal proportions of berries and meat. They determined the readiness of the product by the color of the brine and the density of the fish fibers. Such food allowed the Vikings to settle in areas with extremely cold climates and sparse vegetation. Without fermentation, the history of the northern peoples could have ended much earlier and more tragically. This method of preservation made northerners masters of long, autonomous voyages around the world. They could go months without calling at ports, feeding on supplies from airtight wooden vessels. It was a triumph of human ingenuity over the processes of natural decay and death. Would you dare to try such fish? Write about it in the comments below this video. You've probably never heard of this unique secret because it seems unbelievable. The Vikings developed a method of storing meat in whey, which they called Sur for short. It was a special liquid obtained after the production of homemade cheese or traditional thick skyr. Meat immersed in such baths was actually marinated and preserved in a dense acidic environment. The high concentration of lactic acid created an impenetrable barrier to any dangerous bacteria and fungi. The method allowed huge animal carcasses to be stored for 2 or even 3 years. For this purpose, massive stone vats were used, which were dug into the cool floor of the storage room. The meat was first lightly dried in the dry wind to remove excess surface moisture. The pieces were completely immersed in whey, ensuring that the flesh did not come into contact with the surrounding air. The vat was covered with a heavy stone lid, which was sometimes additionally sealed with wax or fat. The acidic environment not only killed microbes, but also gradually softened the toughest fibers. This method was vital in Iceland and Greenland due to the shortage of salt. Animal husbandry was the basis of life in the colonies, and the loss of meat could be a real disaster. Sur allowed all available raw materials to be processed immediately after the mass autumn slaughter of livestock. Even after a year of storage, the meat remained tender and required only minimal heat treatment. It was a technological revolution that allowed northerners to colonize the most lifeless corners of the northern hemisphere. The taste of such meat was described as specifically sour, reminiscent of modern fermented milk products. For the Vikings, this aroma was synonymous with security, prosperity, and satiety in every home. They learned to use a byproduct of milk production to save their most valuable resource. This system of resource processing demonstrates the incredible economic efficiency of ancient agriculture. Whey was available in every yard where cows or hardy sheep were kept. It was not poured out, but collected in special containers for future use and preservation. Over time, the liquid became only more sour, which only improved its protective properties for meat. The Vikings valued this cycle of substances, which gave them independence from external supplies of salt. The process of immersing meat was accompanied by special rituals designed to protect the supplies from evil spirits. Stone vats were often decorated with runes symbolizing abundance, preservation, and vitality. People believed that the right words and signs helped the whey work more effectively and reliably. This was a close intertwining of practical experience and the ancient mystical beliefs of the Northerners. When the meat was taken out of the vat, it was thoroughly washed in clean spring water. After that, it could be boiled, fried, or smoked over an open fire. The sourness gave the dishes a special charm, which became a characteristic feature of the cuisine of those harsh times. It was the food of warriors accustomed to rough but very high-calorie and honest food. Sur helped people survive the years when the grass on the pastures burned out or was covered with ice. The availability of such meat baths ensured the survival of the weakest members of the community in difficult times. The technology did not require complex tools, only patience and the right temperature in the cellar. Scandinavian ingenuity turned ordinary cheese-making waste into a powerful tool for global expansion. Today, historians find evidence of the widespread use of this method in many settlements in the North Atlantic. It became the key to the longevity of colonies cut off from Europe for months and years. We can only marvel at the wisdom of our ancestors, who found gold where others saw only water. Like this if you are impressed by this idea of using dairy products to preserve meat. What you are about to learn will change your perception of the power of ordinary wind. The Vikings turned the cold Atlantic breezes into a powerful industrial dehydrator for preserving tons of fish. Huge wooden frames were built on the coasts of Norway and Iceland to dry gutted cod. The air, saturated with salt and iodine, instantly sealed the surface of the fish, completely preventing decay. Within a few weeks, the carcass turned into a solid block that could be stored for years. This product was called stockfish, and it became the first real global currency of the Sea Vikings. Dried fish did not require any packaging. It was light, compact, and very nutritious. It could be eaten right on the open sea or soaked before cooking soup. The Vikings chose places with a constant breeze for drying, away from damp and dark forests. Every coastal cliff by the sea was turned into a natural factory for the mass production of provisions. The air drying process required taking into account the phases of the moon and the exact direction of seasonal winds. Northerners knew that the spring sun combined with frost gave the best results. The fish did not simply dry, it underwent a process of natural sublimation at low temperatures. This allowed it to retain all the healthy fats and proteins necessary for the health of the warriors. Stockfish was the ideal food for expeditions, where every kilogram of cargo counted. It did not spoil in heat or dampness if it remained dry inside the structure. Even today, Norway uses the same methods, recognizing them as absolutely unmatched. The Vikings understood that the elements were not enemies, but allies when approached correctly. They created logistics chains connecting the fishing grounds of the north with the rich markets of the south. Simple dried fish became the fuel for the great discoveries and endless wars of that era. The drying racks were set up so that birds could not easily reach the valuable catch. The smell of drying cod spread for many kilometers, symbolizing the wealth and power of the coastal settlement. Working in such factories required the participation of the entire community, young and old alike. It was hard work, but it paid off during the hungriest and darkest months of winter. Fish prepared in this way could be transported in ordinary woven baskets or sacks. It was resistant to shocks and falls, remaining edible even after the most severe trials. The stockfish trade allowed the Vikings to establish connections with the most remote corners of the world at that time. Many European cities grew precisely because of trade in this northern stone product. The Vikings took great care to ensure that the fish did not get wet during accidental storms or prolonged rains. For this purpose, removable canopies made of coarse fabric or wide boards were used. If moisture got inside the fish, it could quickly spoil from the inside, destroying many days of work. Experience in observing the sky was critical to the success of the harvesting process. Interestingly, stockfish retained almost all of its properties during long-term storage in warehouses. It could be taken on a voyage several years after it was dried. This made fish the most reliable strategic reserve for any king or jarl. The Vikings' endurance was largely based on this dry and solid ration. How difficult do you think it was to protect such open reserves from wild animals in bad weather? This question remains relevant for historians studying the life of coastal villages in that distant era. In the next chapter, you will learn how an ordinary swamp was turned into an ideal safe for food. The bogs of Scandinavia held a power that the Vikings used to store fats. Due to the complete absence of oxygen, the peat environment created ideal conditions for the centuries-long preservation of organic matter. The Vikings placed oil in wooden tubs and buried them deep in the moss. In such natural packaging, fats could be stored for years without going rancid or losing their properties. Peat acted as a natural antiseptic, destroying any attempts by bacteria to penetrate the container. A layer of sphagnum moss above the treasure served as an excellent insulator from the summer heat, maintaining a stable temperature. Archaeologists still find such vats of oil, which theoretically remains edible. The Vikings used swamps not only as hiding places, but also as cold storage for surplus food. The process of extracting the product required precise knowledge of landmarks, as the bog constantly changes its appearance. Often, such places were marked with special stones or notches on trees, understandable only to the owner. After several months in the bog, the oil acquired a light, woody aroma, prized by gourmets. It was a way not only to preserve the product, but also to slightly improve its taste. In addition to oil, leather bags with pork fat or salted meat were hidden in the swamps. This practice made the Vikings virtually invulnerable in the face of sudden crop failures or enemy raids. The earth itself took care of the people, providing them with ready-made technological and temperature solutions. The Vikings simply observed how the swamp preserved trees and repeated this method. The use of bog treasures was part of a survival strategy in conditions of constant internecine warfare. If a settlement burned down, the supplies hidden in the bog allowed people to start their lives over again. The bog was a reliable safe, the key to which was only in the memory of the clan elder. It was a wise game with space, where the most dangerous place became the most salvific. The water in such bogs had a special chemical composition that prevented the decomposition of any protein structures. The Vikings noticed that even skin and hair could be preserved in peat for centuries without visible changes. They applied this observation to food, creating a unique system of preservation in the wild. This required courage to enter deadly places and precision in laying the cargo. Each tub was carefully sealed with a layer of resin to prevent bog water from getting inside. The oil inside remained thick and fresh, as if it had just been whipped from fresh cream. This made it possible to accumulate huge reserves of this valuable energy resource for the entire community. The fat was fuel for the bodies of warriors rowing against the cold north wind. Sometimes such treasures were forgotten or lost, remaining in the ground for thousands of years. For modern scientists, such finds have become an invaluable source of information about the diet of the ancient Scandinavians. We can see that the Vikings knew how to use every square meter of their harsh and inhospitable homeland. The swamp was not their enemy, but a reliable and faithful ally. Peat oil was a frequent guest at festive tables during great winter feasts. Its taste was considered a sign of maturity and the right approach to running a complex household. The ability to find the right swamp was as much a talent as the ability to find the right path at sea. This technology was the pinnacle of folk observation and practical application of the laws of biology. To conclude this chapter, it is worth mentioning that bogs were an important element of the logistics of the ancient Northerners. They allowed resources to be distributed across the territory so that food was available at various points along the way. It was an invisible network of warehouses, operating without security or expensive equipment. Nature itself acted as the ideal and incorruptible storekeeper for the warriors of the North. Want to know the secret that allowed settlements to survive in the Arctic and long winters? Many Scandinavian villages had designated cold zones that were architecturally separated from living quarters. The Vikings used the northern side of mountains or natural caves to set up communal deep storage facilities. These places never saw the light of day, and the permafrost inside acted as a freezer. The entrance to such caves was closed with massive wooden doors lined with fur for complete air tightness. Inside, natural circulation of cold air was maintained through specially made narrow crevices. The Vikings knew how to control wind currents to maintain the temperature even during the summer months. This allowed them to store perishable fresh game for a long and reliable period of time. The architecture of longhouses also included cold extensions called utbar. These rooms had no heating and were located in the shadiest part of the house near the cliff. Here, everyday foodstuffs were stored: milk, fresh fish, and freshly baked bread. The walls of these annexes were made of thick stones that slowly released the cold accumulated during the night. The ability to preserve cold was as important as the ability to obtain hot fire. In this struggle against entropy, the northern character was born, prone to precise calculation and planning. The Vikings turned natural caves into veritable fortresses for food, protected from the outside world. It was a simple but effective system of zoning the entire living space of the community. The use of natural ice brought from glaciers also took place in wealthy estates. The ice blocks were covered with straw and sawdust, which allowed them to remain frozen until autumn. In such improvised ice houses, Northerners stored delicacies and alcoholic beverages for future feasts. This required the coordinated work of the entire village to harvest and transport the ice blocks. Inside the ice caves, deer carcasses could lie frozen until spring. This created a strategic supply of meat that did not require salt or complex heat treatment. The Vikings carefully monitored the condition of the ice walls of the cave to avoid collapses or water leaks. Working inside such storage facilities required special care and knowledge of the laws of rock. Collective ownership of such a cave greatly strengthened social ties within each northern community. People understood that their survival depended on the preservation of common supplies in this ice safe. The distribution of food from the cave was strictly controlled by elders or priests in difficult times. This was a guarantee of fairness and the absence of hunger riots within the settlement. Sometimes the caves were deliberately enlarged by humans to accommodate a larger amount of stored provisions. Shelves were carved into the walls to store small vessels with fat or grain. The temperature inside remained stable regardless of how hot the summer was outside. It was a victory of reason over the vagaries of changeable weather and seasonal temperature fluctuations. Heavy doors led into the cold Utbauer annexes, which were always kept tightly closed. This protected the rest of the house from the cold and the food from accidental heat from the central hearth. This layout of the house was the result of centuries of experience living in extremely low temperatures. Each stone in the wall of the cold storage room had its own clear and well-thought-out functional purpose. How much do you think the taste of food would change after such long storage in a cave? The answer to this question lies in the unique conditions of humidity and purity of the cool cave air. In the next chapter, we will learn how the Vikings used ordinary fat to create waterproof armor. There is still a lot of interesting stuff ahead, so stay tuned. The Vikings used animal fat not only as food, but but also as an ideal packaging material. They poured hot fat over roasted meat in ceramic or large wooden vessels. After solidifying, the fat turned into a hard, completely impermeable plug that prevented contact with air. This method allowed cooked food to be stored for a year without losing its nutritional properties. The meat inside remained juicy and was completely protected from any external influences and microbes. Such pots were standard equipment for warriors going on long sea or land expeditions. If necessary, it was enough to simply heat the vessel over a fire, and a hot meal was ready. Fat also served as an additional source of calories, which were necessary in cold and harsh climates. The Vikings preferred to use beef or pork fat as it solidified into the densest mass. It was an ancient form of stew, created 1,000 years before the advent of iron cans. For long-term storage, the fat was sometimes mixed with honey or wax for durability. Herbs added to the mixture prevented oxidation and gave the finished product a pleasant aroma. The process required careful preparation of the raw materials and strict cleanliness when packing the meat into containers. The Vikings understood that any drop of moisture inside could quickly ruin all their hard work. Such care was the key to the safety and health of the whole family during the long winter. This method allowed them to make effective use of absolutely all parts of the animal killed during the hunt. Meat sealed in fat was called confit in later European traditions, but it originated much earlier. The fat plug reliably blocked the access of oxygen, which is the main catalyst for the decomposition of organic matter. The pots could be stored in ordinary cellars or even buried in cold ground for reliability. It was the most compact way to transport ready-to-eat, high-calorie protein. Many warriors appreciated this food for its taste and speed of preparation in the field. In the heat of battle, there was not always time for proper cooking over a large, smoky fire. It was enough to cut open the fat layer and eat the meat cold or slightly warmed over coals. This gave the soldiers of the North a huge advantage in mobility and endurance during raids. The highest quality clay vessels without cracks or chips on the neck were selected for sealing. After pouring in the fat, the neck was tied with a piece of leather or thick fabric for additional mechanical protection. The top of the container could be covered with a layer of resin, creating a completely airtight cocoon for the food. Such packaging could withstand the shaking in a cart and the blows against the sides of a dracker during a storm. The fat also had the ability to draw excess moisture out of the meat, further preserving its structure from the inside. When supplies ran out, the fat from the pot was used to fry other food or to light the dwelling. The Vikings' waste-free economy was the height of rationality in a world of limited resources and harsh conditions. Every gram of fat was considered a treasure that could not be wasted. Today, chefs recognize that meat simmered in its own fat has a unique tenderness and richness of flavor. The Vikings came to this conclusion empirically, seeking above all to ensure the safety of their provisions. They created a technology that has survived for centuries and has come down to us virtually unchanged. This is an example of how a simple idea can change the way an entire warlike civilization eats. To conclude this chapter, it is worth noting that the method of sealing with fat required large reserves of fat itself. This encouraged the Vikings to raise more livestock and engage in whaling in coastal waters. The development of storage technologies directly influenced the development of the economy and agriculture of ancient Scandinavia. Food was the engine of progress, forcing people to look for new ways to ensure their future well-being. Although the title refers to the absence of smokehouses, the Vikings used smoke from the hearth for mild preservation. Food was hung under the roof of the longhouse, where smoke from the central fire constantly circulated. This was not intense hot smoking, but rather a light antiseptic treatment of the meat's surface. Constant exposure to low concentrations of phenols in the smoke created a thin protective film. This prevented the reproduction of flies and other pests inside the room, which was extremely important. Food could hang under the rafters for months, gradually drying out and absorbing the aroma of northern wood. The Vikings used oak or birch for their hearths, which produced the right smoke with the best properties. It was a passive preservation process that took place naturally in the course of everyday family life. Every meal at the hearth helped to preserve supplies for the future without any additional effort on the part of humans. The smoke also effectively repelled excess moisture, keeping the air dry in the upper part of the building. Foods processed in this way acquired a complex and rich flavor that was highly prized. The Vikings loved this taste of home that accompanied them on their most dangerous sea voyages. Hanging food at a height also reliably protected it from domestic animals and small pests. It was a rational use of all the vertical space in the cramped and cold dwellings of that time. The longhouse was not just a dwelling, but a complex biochemical reactor for sustaining life. The method required control over the quality of firewood and the strength of the fire in the central hearth. Too hot a flame could dry out the meat, and too weak a flame would not provide the necessary antiseptic protection. The Vikings were true masters of fire control, understanding its complex and dual nature. Fire gave life, provided necessary warmth, and reliably preserved food for those who would come tomorrow. It was the quiet, everyday magic of northern life, turning harmful smoke into a useful shield. The smoke rose to the ceiling and enveloped the hanging carcasses, creating a kind of gas cover for them. In the absence of chimneys, the smoke lingered inside the house for a long time, penetrating into the deepest pores of the meat. This made the product virtually inedible for mold and most types of putrefactive bacteria. Vikings were accustomed to living in smoky rooms, considering it a small price to pay for the preservation of their provisions. Sometimes special racks were built under the roof to accommodate large quantities of fish at once. The entire catch from a single successful haul could be hung there in a single day. The air under the ceiling was always the warmest and driest in the whole house, which accelerated the dehydration process. It was the ideal place for the final stage of preparing any meat products. Over time, the surface of the meat became dark and shiny from the accumulated resins and soot. This layer served as a reliable shell, protecting the tender interior from contact with oxygen. Before consumption, this crust was usually scraped off with a knife, revealing aromatic meat that was completely ready to eat. The technology was so natural that people did not even consider it a separate type of work. Even today, gourmets appreciate products that have undergone such natural and long cold smoking. The Vikings created a unique flavor profile for their cuisine that cannot be confused with any other. Smoke was their faithful assistant in ensuring food security for the entire great clan. It was an alliance of man, wood, and fire in the fight against time and the laws of decay. Finally, it is worth mentioning that smoke also helped preserve clothing and nets from decay and parasites. All life inside the longhouse was subordinated to the idea of durability and resource conservation. Northerners understood that in their world, everything had to serve for a long time. Otherwise, death would come too quickly. The smoke from the hearth was the invisible guardian of this fragile but heroic and beautiful way of life. Grain was the foundation of stability, and its storage required special tricks in the high humidity of the north. The Vikings built granaries on high stilts to isolate their supplies from the dampness of the cold ground and rodents. The stilts often had special stone canopies that no small pest could get through. Inside the granaries, the grain was constantly stirred with wooden shovels to allow fresh air to flow in. This prevented self-heating and the appearance of black mold in the deep layers of the rich summer harvest. Before being put into storage, the grain was thoroughly dried on flat stones heated by the sun or small fires. The Vikings understood that moisture was the main enemy of longevity and sought to remove it down to the last percentage point. Dry grain could be stored in tight wooden chests for many decades. It was the main strategic reserve in case of protracted wars or global natural disasters. Control over the granary was a symbol of the real power of the Jarl or head of a powerful northern clan. In some cases, grain was stored in airtight clay pits coated with natural wax on the inside. When such a pit was filled, oxygen was quickly depleted, and the grain entered a state of suspended animation. Under such conditions, it did not germinate at all and was not damaged by any insects or fungi. This required enormous labor to prepare the storage facility, but it completely guaranteed the preservation of the valuable seed stock. The Vikings were outstanding agronomists of their time, adapting southern crops to the harsh realities of the north. Protecting the granary was a sacred duty of every warrior in the settlement. The loss of grain meant the inevitable death of the entire clan the following winter from hunger and disease. Therefore, granaries were often located in the very center of the settlement under the vigilant, round-the-clock guard of warriors. They were the embodiment of the diligence and foresight of a people accustomed to relying on their own strength. Each sack of oats or barley was a guarantee that the drakkars would set sail again in the spring. The floor of the granary was made of tightly fitted boards to prevent grain from spilling through the cracks. The walls of the structure had to be as dry as possible and have no openings for cold wind and rain to penetrate. The Vikings often used special aromatic herbs, the smell of which repelled insect pests from the sacks. It was a comprehensive protection system that included physical, biological, and even magical methods of protecting the harvest. Sometimes the grain was lightly roasted beforehand, which killed any larvae inside and improved its taste. Such grain was called floury and was valued for its long shelf life and quickness in cooking porridge. Roasting also reduced the risk of the grain absorbing moisture from the surrounding air during foggy weather. Grain drying masters were held in high esteem in every Scandinavian community. Ventilation in the barns was a finely tuned system of openings that were closed depending on the direction of the wind. This allowed a dry and cool microclimate to be maintained inside at any time of the year. The experience of building such storage facilities was passed down from generation to generation as one of the most important pieces of knowledge about the world. Mistakes in construction could cost the lives of hundreds of people who entrusted their bread to this building. Grain was also used as a measure of weight and a means of payment in trade transactions between communities. It was a universal resource whose value never fell in the cold north. Full granaries allowed the kings to hire more warriors and undertake more daring military campaigns. This was the foundation on which the entire political and military power of the Viking Age rested. To conclude this chapter, we note that the Vikings learned to turn a fragile plant into a reliable resource for survival. Their methods of storing grain were so sophisticated that they allowed seeds to remain viable even after several years of storage. This enabled the Northerners to successfully engage in agriculture even on the edge of the Arctic Circle. Their ability to preserve bread made them not just warriors, but creators of their own unique and powerful civilization. The Vikings' methods of food storage are not just a story of survival, but evidence of human integration into the environment. They did not try to conquer nature. They used its laws to create a sustainable and powerful northern civilization. From earth pits to whey fermentation, every decision was dictated by necessity and honed over centuries. This legacy allows us to understand how a handful of people were able to dominate vast areas of the world. The Vikings' strength lay in their ability to conserve resources where others saw only emptiness. These technologies show that the intellect of 8th century humans was in no way inferior to that of modern scientists. The lack of electricity was compensated for by incredible observation skills and the ability to work with natural materials. The Vikings created an autonomous life support system that worked without external energy sources or complex devices. Today, we are rediscovering these methods as we search for ways to store our food in an environmentally friendly and truly long-term manner. The ancient secrets of the North are once again becoming relevant in a world that strives for sustainability and security. The taste of Viking food was sharp and intense. It was the taste of life itself, snatched from the jaws of death. Every bite of dried cod reminded a warrior of the power of the raging sea and wind. It was honest food containing nothing superfluous, only pure natural energy for battle. The history of the northern peoples is, above all, the history of their grand victory over hunger and eternal cold. And this victory would have been impossible without the ingenious storage methods we have described. In conclusion, we see that the Vikings were great engineers of their daily and harsh lives. Their ships plowed the oceans, and their warehouses reliably stored the fruits of the earth and the generous catch of the sea. This unity of technology and spirit made the Viking era a unique period in the long history of mankind. We can learn a lot from these people who knew how to turn the cold into their ally. Their experience is a reminder that true strength lies in a deep knowledge of the world. Traveling in the footsteps of the Vikings, we find not only the ruins of fortresses, but also the remains of their ingenious storerooms. Hidden in these stones is the wisdom of people who were not afraid to challenge the harshest elements. They taught us that even in the coldest climate, it is possible to create a warm and well-fed home. The legacy of the Northerners lives on in our traditions, cuisine, and ways of interacting with the environment. Each of the 10 chapters of our issue lifted the veil on the secret of the survival of a great maritime power. We saw that behind the outward barbarism lay subtle calculation and a deep respect for the forces of nature. Food was a sacred resource for them, requiring special treatment and protection from people. The Vikings proved that human ingenuity knows no bounds when it comes to preserving one's kind. Their methods were simple to implement, but required a vast knowledge of the properties of substances and time. This folk science allowed the Northerners to survive climatic crises and successfully settle new fertile lands. We see how food became the foundation for building great kingdoms and trading empires. This is a lesson from history that food security is the key to any geopolitical success. The taste of history is not always what we are used to, but it is what has made us who we are. The Vikings left us a world in which cold is not a barrier to a full and vibrant life. We continue on their path, using new knowledge but relying on the same principles of reliability. May the example of the ancient Northerners inspire us to new discoveries in our daily lives. Today's story has come to an end, but the secrets of the past are endless and await their patient explorer. We hope that this immersion into the life of the Vikings has helped you see familiar things in a new light. History is not only dates, but also the smells, tastes, and ways of preserving our common heritage. Stay with us to learn more about how the world of our distant ancestors was built.
Perfect, just like the old days. A true taste of our heritage.
We are concluding our extensive study of how the harsh Vikings overcame hunger without modern technology. These ancient methods, from swamps to whey, show us the true power of human ingenuity. Which of these discoveries did you find most practical or perhaps most strange for our time? Suggest topics for future videos about ancient life and technology that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new, exciting stories about our world's great past.